My name is Mark Koenig. I'm the director of the Presbyterian Ministry at the United Nations. I'm also the co-chair of the NGO Working Group on Israel-Palestine. On behalf of the working group, on behalf of Global Policy Forum, on behalf of Just World Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation and conversation on the tragic legacies of Lebanon's Phalangists. I will introduce the person who will introduce the speaker, having also introduced myself. Helena Cobban is a longtime writer and researcher on the Middle East. She's also the author of 4 books on the region. For 17 years, Helena contributed a column on global affairs to the Christian Science Monitor and also the Arabic daily Al-Hayat. 2 years ago, she founded Just World Books, which is the publisher of Jonathan Randal's latest book, The Tragedy of Lebanon. And it's now my pleasure to present Helena, who will introduce us to Jonathan.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I'd really like to thank Mark and the other members of the NGO Working Group on Israel and Palestine here at the United Nations. I think the work that you folks do is very important and wonderful, and I hope that this fits well into your plans. I see there's a sign-up sheet at the back, so if anybody hasn't signed in, then I think Mark and I would both like to have your contact details if possible. Thank you again for turning up. It's my real pleasure to introduce John Randal, which I will do in a moment, but I'll just tell you first why I decided that we should republish his book. This is actually a reissue of the title that he originally published in 1983 under the title Going All the Way. It was a slightly unfortunate title, but he tells us in the new preface that it was suggested to him by John le Carré. So if, you know, John le Carré suggested a book title to you, could you turn him down? I don't know, probably not. So anyway, we put a new title, a wonderful new preface that John has contributed based on, I mean, looking back, you know, what was the actual meaning of those very important events from 1975 through 1982? And of course, this year is the 30th anniversary of what happened in 1982, Israel's massive invasion of Lebanon, which killed 19,000 people between Lebanese and Palestinians, culminating, let us say, in the massacres at Sabra and Shatila this September. So I was hoping that this book, by reissuing this book, this could be a resource for a new generation of people who weren't alive in 1982. John Randal was there, he did cover it, and he has some very good reflections on the meaning of all of those events in the preface to this new book. The book also has a wonderful cover that is actually, it features, obviously, John's face superimposed on an iconic photo of a Phalangist action in 1976 during the Civil War. The photo was taken by his and my mutual friend, Françoise Desmoulins, and with this photo, she became the first woman ever to win the World Press Photo Award. So she passed away, sadly, a couple of years ago, but I've been very pleased to be able to use and bring attention to her photo and her achievements as well in this way. So another reason that it's really important that we hear from John, I don't know if you read his op-ed that he had in the International Herald Tribune and the online edition of the New York Times last Friday, drawing attention to the plight of the minorities in the whole region in light of the current unrest in Syria, which is something that I think, you know, John has been at the forefront of drawing attention to this issue. Of course, one of the biggest minorities in Syria as elsewhere in the region are the Palestinian refugees who, wherever there is unrest or civil disorder, are extremely vulnerable because they are stateless. And we saw that in Iraq, and we saw the vulnerability of the Christian communities in Iraq and other minorities. So I think, you know, looking at this issue of minorities, in a sense that encompasses the Palestinian minority, which are stateless people, and we all know how uniquely vulnerable that makes them. But let me come back to why I'm really, really happy to work with John Randal. When I went to work in Lebanon as a cub reporter in...
Only yesterday.
1975. 74, okay, we all get old. John was really one of my mentors. He was a very senior foreign correspondent. I think he was the senior foreign correspondent for the Washington Post at the time. But he never carried himself like a big mandarin. He was an on-the-ground reporter, used the shoe leather, went here and there, really investigated matters on the ground, and was fearless. You know, many of our colleagues, well, a certain number of our colleagues actually perished during that war through their coverage of it. And I had moments of sheer terror, and I'm sure that John did as well. But he carried on and did the reporting, which culminated in the book, and now I'm very pleased to be able to reissue the book. What else can I tell you about John? This was his first book, Going All the Way. His next book was a study of the Kurds in Iraq. So he really does understand a lot about minority issues in the region. And his third book was on Osama bin Laden. And you know, he obviously has a great analysis of how important all these issues are in fueling the kind of the ideological underpinnings of radical, violent Islamism. So I don't think I should say anything more because John is here, he can speak for himself, and I'm really delighted to welcome John Randal.
Thank you,
Helen. Helen has added yet another halo around her head for having reissued this book. People write books, books have a very short shelf life, and be brought back to life after 29 years is a resurrection that I need to tell Presbyterians is wonderful. There's one thing that she...
Sorry, Neil, could you make an announcement about cell phones?
Oh, can we tell it to...
You turn this thing off.
The cell phones to be turned off. Inventions of the devil. Helena neglected to tell you something else about the title, and I hope I will not give it offense, but I really wanted the book to be called originally. The reason John le Carré gave me the title Going All the Way, which in all ignorance I did not realize had to do with teenage sex, was because my publisher, Elizabeth Sifton, who was then at Viking, rejected my proposed title, which was Wayward Christian Soldiers, and I was unable to persuade Helena that it was the first and best title. Anyhow, never mind. I mean, even Helena is not perfect. I'm going to read a passage from the book, but the important thing, I think, is that if you leave, the Middle East is full of unresolved massacres, and you know, there used to be an old Foreign Legion song saying, "Today's your turn, tomorrow's mine," and in a way, that's the reality that we're dealing with. The Palestinian, what happened to the Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila was all the more inexcusable in that the French, the United States, and the Italians had evacuated the PLO after a long and very nasty siege, and the Israelis had promised not to go into West Beirut, which they did. And we now know that General Sharon, who was the defense minister, all along had wanted to go into West Beirut, and there are documents that proved it. And what happened was the president-elect, Bashir Jamal, who was elected by and large thanks to the Israeli invasion, 3 weeks after his election, was killed in turn, and Sharon, panicking, thinking that the whole war was in jeopardy, the war aims were in jeopardy, went into West Beirut and instigated, encouraged, egged on Bashir Jamal's leaderless louts to go into Sabra Shatila to do the killing. These things happen, quote unquote. What's interesting is that in Lebanon, nobody has gone back and really looked at what happened. In Israel, there was an official commission. In a way, it was the smartest things the Israelis ever did, because the remit was very narrow. It did blame Sharon. Sharon was obliged to retire as a defense minister, but he stayed in the government. We know he's now in a coma, and I don't want to say before a religious group is deeply deserved, but some of us might think so. Anyhow, before I read the passage, one final remark, and two remarks. The op-ed piece I did about the Syrian situation really asked the question, what happens if the stalemate is broken and the President Bashar Assad's government falls? The problem in the Middle East with minorities is that if they hang on, if they rule for a long time, when they fall, there can be bloody retribution, and this is what I worry about very much. So that it's, in a way, when you think about it, at the time the Beirut Christians felt, the Lebanese Maronites, or the hardliners among them, to be more accurate, because it certainly wasn't all the Christians and not even all the Maronites, felt they were threatened and committed massacres, plural, the most well-known of which was Sabra Shatila. And in Syria, several months before, in the city of Hama, Bashar Assad's father, Hafiz, and his brother carried out a massive massacre in Hama because he felt threatened, because the regime, the family felt threatened, and the Alawite minority, 12% of the population approximately, felt threatened. So that you could be, people who feel threatened are tempted to do very dangerous and horrible things. One final thing before I read this passage is, I feel I'm preaching to the converted when I say to you that the Palestinian issue is not going to go away, and that it's the default position, you know this better than I do, for everything else in the Muslim world. If you have only to read Ayman Zawahiri's book that came out several months after 9/11, where he says, we tried this in Egypt, we tried that in Egypt, everything's failed, we couldn't take power, we were smashed. But no matter what, if we wanted to get people behind us, all we had to do is push the Palestine issue. So it's an emotional issue from one end of the Muslim world to the other. So even if we didn't really like the Palestinians or care about them, or were totally in the pro-Israeli, and there's no reason some people might not be. It's not my cup of tea, but maybe some. Even so, it behooves us to worry about the problem because it's not going to go away. Anyhow, with that, I'm going to read this passage, and as Helena, who chose this passage, so it's not my fault, pointed out, it is somewhat gruesome. It's dealing with the details of what actually happened. The operation served both Israeli and Lebanese forces' purposes. The Lebanese forces were the militiamen of President-elect Bashir Jamal. As the Israeli Army Monthly, Skira Hodeshit, was to note blindly by way of confirmation, the Lebanese forces hoped to, quote, to provoke, quote, the general exodus of the Palestinian population, first from Beirut, then from Lebanon. The Christians, comma, the Monthly added, wanted thus to create a new demographic balance in Lebanon. No more than 200 Lebanese militiamen crossed the lines of Israeli troops surrounding the camps on Thursday, it was September 16th, after dusk. Virtually without let-up, for the next 38 hours, they massacred men, women, children, even horses, dogs, and cats in cold blood. Although Israeli commanders and troops surrounding the camp knew what was going on inside, As Israel's Kahan Commission established in its investigation of the massacres, they did nothing to stop the slaughter. An Israeli lieutenant who witnessed the murder of 2 unarmed Palestinians was told by his battalion commander, "We know it's not to our liking, but we don't interfere." Almost all the victims were unarmed civilians. Grenades, knives, hatchets, revolvers, assault rifles, as well as an occasional artillery piece, were used in the butchery. In some cases, breasts and penises were hacked off, crosses carved into the flesh as a Christian signature, pregnant women's bellies ripped open, and in one instance, the members of a child cut off and disposed on an ironing board in a circle around his head. Some of the bodies were booby-trapped, so that the burial of them was difficult and dangerous. Before the burial parties stopped counting in the Levantine sun, bodies became rapidly unidentifiable. The official International Committee of the Red Cross death toll stood at 313. The Civilian Defense Organization counted another 43 dead, and at least 146 further victims were buried by friends and relatives. Mass graves are known to exist, but have not been dug up. It's true even today. Months later, some Palestinians remain convinced that as many as 3,000 camp residents were missing and presumed dead. In the absence of any accurate statistics, some serious reckonings suggested that the Palestinians may have accounted for as few as 1/3 of the victims. Indeed, some sources indicated that the Lebanese Shia Muslims made up at least 1/3, perhaps 1/2 the death toll, with citizens of Egypt, Syria, and other Arab countries accounting for the remainder. Still other sources reported that 991 camp residents remained unaccounted for. As many as 1/3 of these may have been Lebanese. The use of bulldozers, both to trap people inside their cinder-block homes and to hide the evidence, bespoke of both barbarity and a certain confusion born of fear that these misdeeds would come to light. Months later, one of the killers spoke movingly of his part in the massacre. Taking down his personal diary, he read aloud, "Shoot them against the pink and blue walls. Slaughter them in the half-light of evening." Asking how many Palestinians had been killed in the camps, his boss, also present, said, "You'll find out if ever they build a subway in Beirut." He left no doubt that there were many, many more victims than listed in the official account. There's one final update on this. The Israelis, an extraordinary Israeli filmmaker named Folman made a wonderful movie, some may have seen, called Waltz with Bashir, which is rather interesting because, it's Israeli. It's about a young infantryman who was flown up to Beirut just before this operation. Now, as the Israelis have decided to break their word to the international community and go into West Beirut. And the man's scared to death. I mean, if you've ever been in an army, it's not fun to be in infantry during war. And he's talking to his shrink, he's talking to a friend of his who had been in the same regiment, and it's quite an interesting movie. It has one thing that sort of bothers me, and everything's in animation except one passage which was taken from newsreels, which shows an Arab woman saying, "Where are the Arabs? Where are the Arabs?" Well, that's true, where are the Arabs? But on the other hand, it was really the Israelis who set the thing up. On the Lebanese side, there is an extremely moving, even excruciatingly awful, but very important documentary, which has been shown all around the world except for one place, Lebanon. And it was done by the son of a former Shia Muslim MP. The young man's name is Luqman Slim. I knew his father in the old days. And he and his German wife, sort of very big blonde Valkyrie kind of woman, got to know some of the people who had gone into the camps and done the killing, and got them to agree to be interviewed. There was one condition: you don't see their faces. In a way, the film is all the more telling because you see the bodies moving, or petting a cat, or it is an extraordinarily powerful movie. It's called Massacres with an S at the end. And as I say, the pity is it's never been, I think it's been shown once in Lebanon, one day, one time. My concern, and I'm sure yours, is how to get justice for the Palestinians, but also how to prevent more minorities, whether we think they're good guys or bad guys, from falling victim to massive retribution. And that's a tall order. I'm not sure this op-ed piece that I wrote at Helena's instigation, I say, obviously there are geostrategic interests at play in Syria, which involve the future, quote unquote, of the Middle East. I say quote unquote because I've heard that so often in a long lifetime, I tend to doubt it. But quite apart from whether Iran and its allies or the West and its allies prevail geopolitically, I'm worried, and perhaps you are, I hope you are, by the fate of all kinds of minorities. The nature of minority regimes in the Middle East often means that the ruling minority both protects and manipulates the other minorities. And in Syria, 30% of the population are not Sunni Muslims. They are Kurds, who have been in many cases dispossessed, have been kicked around over the years. There are a Druze population, and there are many Christians. How many Christians there are, I don't know. Perhaps you know better than I do. It's very difficult to ascertain how many Christians there are left. There's been a regrettable but steady exodus of Christians over many years, but they are also in play. What is going to happen if, let's think about the worst case, which I'm afraid is happening right now. There's a stalemate, which means things continue. Killing continues. People become more and more upset, angry with each other, and thus, but what is going to happen to the Alawites if this regime falls? Many of you might say, well, they haven't been entirely upright citizens, to put it mildly. The more than 40 years they've been in power, but there's still approximately 12% of the population. In the old days, they would have gone to the hills, and were difficult for the Sultan's army to go get them. I mean, that doesn't obtain in the days of the helicopter, much less the days of the drone. So what I fear is that, and I find it somewhat odd hearing myself say this, but nonetheless, because I'm quite cognizant of some of the many excesses of the Alawite regime, but I'm very worried that the regime is going to fall, and there are going to be a lot of, not necessarily totally innocent, but still not totally guilty either, people who are going to be put to the sword. I don't know what one does about it. I would hope that your groups, that think tanks in general, would be doing some serious thinking and making serious suggestions. I take it that a very good friend of mine who's a former American diplomat, an Arabist, who still goes to Washington quite often and keeps up with matters in the Middle East, he said that as far as he could do, nobody in the State Department was thinking about this. Maybe there are other parts of the government that are, but whatever your groups can do to say, look, the one thing we don't want is more civilian victims who are coming to a sticky end, the better. And I know that you're from Helena, that your group has been very active and very powerful in trying to draw attention to nasty situations. And I will end by saying that once again, to me, the worst case, the most unfair case, are the Palestinians. But they're not. They risk a lot of other people who can end up in the same category. Thank you very much.
Do we have some questions for Jonathan?
Sir.
What was the name of that documentary? Massacres?
Sir? The name of the movie is Massacres, M-A-S-S-A-C-R-E-S, or M-A, they may have spelled it with a K, M-A-S-S-A-K-E-R-S. And the man's name is Lokman, I think he spells it L-O-K-M-A-N, Slim, S-L-I-M. And it's been shown in various, it's well known in documentary film festivals. Sir?
My name is Ralph Kader. I want to ask you a question about your experience in the Middle East and what do you think the solution would be for the Palestinians? Is it going to keep lingering, in the area, or do you think they might come to a solution? And what your advice, since you live there, you covered a lot of stories, so how's your feeling about what's going to happen with the Arab Spring and so on?
Well, the truth is several things. The Palestinians and the Arab Spring, let me take the most optimistic one first. The Arab Spring, I am quite optimistic about Tunisia. I think Tunisia is an extremely interesting example, and I'll tell you why. The origins of the Arab Spring were not just spontaneous combustion, nor was it political opposition. It was rather opposition centered in a rather small, upper-class, well-educated nucleus, which existed even before the French took over Tunis in 1880. And many of the key movers and shakers were women, extremely courageous women. And they would go out of the country, get on things like Al Jazeera and other televisions. What they said got beamed back into Tunisia. They fly back into Tunis airport. They've been picked up by the goons and beaten to find Marolais. These are very strong people. And they provided a kind of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word. You can't say Christian witness because they're Muslims, but a kind of moral backbone to, and which I think a lot of the, in a way, I don't like this word, informed, it influenced what happened. And when you think about why did Tunisia work and why was it the first place, I mean, it was supposed to be the last place, Who took this tiny country very seriously? It had a kind of comic opera dictator named Ben Ali who had a hairdresser wife who kept building palaces and ripping people off. But it was sort of straight out of Borat. But it was, as I suggest, it was this nucleus of people. I admit many of them are my friends and have been for many years. I have endless respect for them. And one of the reasons it worked is because Ben Ali, the dictator, didn't trust his army. So he trusted his police force, but the crowds became such that the police could not handle it. He asked the general commanding the army to help, who refused to do so. So that's how it happened. And the next thing was the nature, and I think this is an interesting, perhaps, insight. Under Bourguiba, who was the founding father of the Tunisian Republic, the father of independence, he was raised by French Republican school teachers, all of whom were secular. And when he became leader of the country in 1954, he said, don't respect Ramadan, women have rights, etc. And he was, with the 1950s, this is radical talk. He talked back to Nasser. I mean, he was an interesting character. And there is, even among the Islamists, the Ennahda party, there was a long effort on the part of this same group of sort of upper middle class, educated people in Tunis to say to the Islamists, look, we're in the opposition, you're in the opposition, but we're trying to do this in a parliamentary democratic way, and there's certain rules. And this party called the MDS, which spent a lot of time with Ennahda leaders, trying to explain that this is how you do it, and we respect you, and they were utterly reasonable people. It didn't work. First of all, the regime sat on them, and most of the Islamists were either jailed or went abroad. But Ghannouchi, the leader of the Ennahda who was sent abroad, lived in London for a long time. He didn't live in the Gulf. And you know, if you live in London for a while, your eyes are open and your ears are open. I'm not saying he's a perfect Democrat, but I do not think, even when I read and I'm upset by certain excesses, which I would prefer not to have happened, I have a kind of innate feeling that another party is not going to seek total control. Think back the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where people said, one man, one vote, one time. I've not yet heard the one time, even in Egypt, or Yemen. One has the feeling that perhaps the Islamists have learned from their past errors, or perhaps it has entered the genetic code of certain Muslim societies that that is not the way to go. I'm not at all but to get back to your question, that's the only place I'm really quite optimistic about, and quite is perhaps an exaggeration. Egypt's going through a real revolution. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It's fascinating, if you, week by week. Now, the Palestinians. The fate of the Palestinians depends very much on the United States government. We all know that, and none of us know. The United States government, for its own reasons and reasons which it considers to be geopolitical, has decided to basically shaft the Palestinians. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. How does this change? I think it probably changes. I suspect when the Israelis wake up and discover that occupation is an extremely expensive way to go, and that they risk their own democratic life. I'm 79 years old, and I've been watching this for a long time. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
I saw Dave next, and let's follow Ralph's example and introduce ourselves.
Yeah, I'm David Weaver with Church World Service, and formerly was the director for the Middle East Program for the National Council of Churches. So I have some familiarity with the Christian minorities throughout the region. And I absolutely kind of concur with your comment about in a sense, the opaqueness of U.S. policy towards minorities within the region. I think that's never been a concern, except if those minorities are empowered, right? And then they can be useful. But otherwise, I think they're regarded as a kind of irritant to the implementation of U.S. policy. And I'll just say frankly, I've only met one U.S. diplomat in the region who I thought was genuinely concerned. But on this, that's just by way of affirmation. On going back to Sabra and Shatila, though, this issue about what was the actual role of the Israelis, and I think that it was much more active than what you have indicated. I mean, not only did they allow the Phalangists into the camps, but they also put a cordon around the camps, so no Palestinians could leave. They provided water, food, and ammunition.
Absolutely.
And then they also provided, in the night, they also did things like shoot flares over the camps, so that the militiamen could continue to work through the night. So it was, I mean, it was very, very much using the Phalangists to carry out. I mean, they were the ones whose fingers were on the triggers, but it was very much under the control of the Israelis.
Thank you very much for making that point. It's since been determined that Sharon, very early on in the invasion, desperately wanted to get the Christians involved. I mean, he wanted to, from my point of view, share the guilt, but certainly it was essential to get them involved. And frankly, Bashir Jamal, look back at that extraordinary year in 1982, he was very clever. He didn't do it. There was only one instance in which his militia actually participated in a firefight alongside the Israelis, because he said to himself, "I want to be president of Lebanon. The Israelis are going to help me get there, but once I'm president, I want to be my own man." And I could go on and explain that. There was a very interesting meeting on the 1st of September with Begin and Bashir Jamal, and Begin just took him to pieces. Why did he lost control? Begin was an old man. As an old man myself, I understand these matters. And completely lost it. The reason he lost it is because the American ambassador, Sam Lewis, had called up and told Begin, who was up at a resort, a place called Nairia, I've got to come and see you. And Begin says, you know, I'm on holiday, can't you come next week? And Sam Lewis said, no, instructions of my government, I'm to see you now. So Sam arrived and said, in 2 hours' time, President Reagan is going to make a major speech, and Begin went absolutely ballistic because, one, the Americans rather foolishly, I will spare you all the Middle East diplomacy, had promised not to spring diplomatic initiatives on the Israelis without warning, and two, he realized, because he wasn't dumb, that he was probably the last person who was told in the region. Indeed, other diplomats had been sent to the King of Jordan days ahead of time to prepare him. And that anger carried over when he, hours later, finally met Bashir Jamal and tore him to pieces. You know, Bashir was not the brightest guy in the block, but he was crestfallen. He thought it was going to be a love-in. When he got back to Beirut, his advisor said, this is terrific. Now we can say you're not, you know, the Israelis mistreated you, they treated you like the word was a busboy, a bellhop. And Bashir then used it. The last 2 weeks of his life, he turned the thing around, saying, I'm going to be president of all the Lebanese, I'm not the person you thought I was, etc. So it became, this by way of explaining that Sharon, since the beginning, had said there are 2,000, 2,500, the number kept changing, so-called stay-behinds, who are, even after the if we ever arrive at the evacuation of the PLO, are going to be there. This was justification for going into West Beirut, and once Bashir was assassinated, Israeli generals who leadership went around and talked to the various Phalangist commanders who had just lost their leader. You know, and egged them on. He was dogs and cats. I'm not for a second excusing what happened, but the Israeli responsibility is patent. So I agree with you, and I thank you for pointing that out.
Great. We've got Nushin, and I think I saw a hand over on this side of the room. Okay, so we'll go Nushin, and then okay, two over here.
Hi, I'm Nushin Framke from the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, which is a grassroots network. And I'm an Armenian from Iran, a minority there, a minority.
I understand where you're coming from.
So I was, I mean, I've been talking about that you can't use blanket statements about minorities in the Middle East because there's such a wide range. For example, the Israeli ambassador has been talking about the plight of the Middle Eastern Christians and painting them all with one brush. The most recent thing, actually it's not the most recent, but for example, the Christians of Iraq, their situation changed with the U.S. invasion, for example.
Read my preface.
So I was wondering if you could untangle what for me is a web that I can't untangle, the situation in Syria.
Well, the answer is I can't because it's terribly complicated. but no, I'm not.
Somewhat.
No, well, I don't know things I don't know them. But on your point about the Israeli ambassador, Begin in 1981 encouraged a situation in which the Bashir Jamal's militiamen tried to provoke a war between Israel and Syria, and Begin at the last moment didn't do it because he wanted to hit the nuclear plant in Baghdad which was just before the Israeli elections, which was a better target. But Begin delighted. He said, you know, the idea that he, a man who began his life as a downtrodden Polish Jew, should be saving Christians. I mean, this was, you know, this was just terrific. I mean, for him, this is the ultimate irony that he should, the persecuted minorities should be saving other persecuted minorities. Never mind that Begin and others in the Australian establishment for many years had been encouraging the Maronite radicals to subvert their own government. But what is the situation? All you can do in Syria is look at the nature of the so-called Mosaic state, in which you have all these minorities. And as I think I said, the Alawites both protect and manipulate the other minorities, which means that they become identified, or could be, or are becoming, or may be becoming, or maybe it's too late, or maybe there's still time. I can't fill in those blanks for you. The fatal reckoning when the regime either changes or is overthrown peacefully or semi-peacefully or is overthrown, are the other minorities. Certainly the Alawites going to get in the neck. I cannot see any situation in which, especially those Alawites who are living outside of what had been their historic home along the hills of the Mediterranean, facing the Mediterranean, I cannot see a happy ending for those people. They're either going to have to leave the big cities, or it's going to be very bad. What will happen to the Christians? I don't know. What will happen to the Druze are usually quite prudent. The Kurds are, the Kurdish minority is enormous. They've been dispossessed. Many of them came after the failure of a major uprising in Turkish Kurdistan in 1925. The French running Syria and Lebanon under the League of Nations mandate protected the Kurds. Protected, Reed probably used them. There were many of the people in the so-called Troupes de Levant, which were the French auxiliaries in mandate Syria between the two wars, were drawn from the minority. Druze, less Christians, but Druze, some Kurds. Wasn't Shashakli a Kurd? The presidents, the army is always the way up in these societies. Hafez al-Assad was, think of it, he was an Alawite minority. He was a member of the Ba'ath Party. Why? Because the Ba'ath Party was pan-Arab, and thus you could be a member of a minority in a predominantly Sunni world and participate politically. And he was in the Air Force, which was the minority armed forces. So these things are terribly difficult to pull apart. Many of the big Sunnis families who were rich before and are even richer now had back and probably still are backing Assad. It's not, you know, none of these things are easy, and that's the worry is if this stalemate continues, it's going to get worse rather than better. I think, you know, if you look at if the Lebanese mess has any lessons for us, is the longer these go on, the more irrational they become. And in Lebanon, it ended up with fighting inside each community, not just one against the other community.
Helena asked if she could respond, and then we'll come back to the next question.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what John said, which I agree with completely. Obviously, it is very complex what's happening in Syria, but I don't have as much chance to write now as I used to. But I think the last piece I wrote in the Monitor was, Christian Science Monitor, was maybe about a year ago about Syria, when I said, although everybody was predicting that, you know, Bashar al-Assad would get swept away extremely rapidly, I said, no, you know, there's much more resilience there to his regime than is being portrayed in the Western media. And what I was arguing for very strongly, and I still argue for, is a South Africa-style negotiated transition to democracy, which I think is the only way forward, because we have seen where so-called transition from a minority regime or from a very oppressive regime to full democracy has been achieved by force of arms in Iraq and Libya, and you see the outcome of that and the huge, unbelievable human suffering that has been imposed because the whole culture of violence and resolving issues through force of arms, has its own momentum. So the big example that I look at is South Africa, where, back in the 1980s, back when I was, the first thing that drew me to a concern with international affairs when I was growing up in England in the 1960s was the South African situation, where, in England it was much bigger there in the 60s. It became bigger here later. But everybody was fearing the same thing, that, if there's majority rule, there will be a bloodbath for the white minority, which was also about the same proportion. It was, somewhere between 11 and 15% of South Africa's citizens were white. And people were saying, there's no way, after the way that the blacks and other non-white South Africans have been treated for 400 years in that country, that there won't be a bloodbath against the whites. And there wasn't. To me that was like unbelievable, like grace in action. How you had these two leaderships on both sides, and I give full credit to the white leadership, which finally came around, and I think that Frederick de Klerk's Peace Prize was fully earned. But so obviously it was Nelson Mandela's. You had these two, that is what I would urge our diplomats and our civil society to be working for here, is a negotiated transition to democracy. And that involves not calling explicitly for regime change and not acting explicitly for regime change. Because if back in the 80s, Western diplomats and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and everything back then had been saying, as a precondition, the white minority regime has to go and de Klerk has to resign, they wouldn't have engaged him in a negotiation. The white South Africans would have had their backs up against the wall and would have fought with all the power at their command, which was huge. So, as a matter both of principle, since I am a Quaker, and of pure pragmatism, I think that we have to be urging engagement of this regime, however foul its actions, in the diplomatic process. At a time when Hillary Clinton is engaging the junta in Burma, which has committed far worse actions, and everybody is saying, she's really doing well, she's opened up space for Aung San Suu Kyi. She's, managed to actually damp down the violence of the regime. People are applauding that, but they're calling for escalation and violence in Syria. What is the difference? Honestly, sorry, I just had to come in there. And the last thing on this is people say, it's too late. It is never too late to start a serious program of diplomatic engagement and negotiation. Because as we know, 10 years after the invasion of Iraq, the alternative is far, far worse.
One thing, something struck me. Our people are sort of worrying about why, for instance, inside Lebanon, it's been so slow a process to come to terms with what happened. And there are people thinking about it. There's a quite extraordinary woman who was born in Lebanon, educated in our country, and teaches at the Collège de France. Her name is Aida Kanafani Zarar, and she's doing she's written a lot of very interesting stuff on what it is within Lebanon, and I think what obtains from Lebanon more or less can obtain elsewhere, why it is so difficult for these societies to come to terms with responsibility, with guilt, because right now we're nowhere. And I don't for a second disagree with Helena, but I don't know. We've made our lives a bit complicated as Americans because the administration, reluctantly, I think, and leading from the back, quote unquote, did participate in the Libyan business. And you can I suspect there are not terribly many people who stand up and root for the late Mr. Gaddafi, but still, the UN resolution authorizing NATO participation said one thing, and we and the British and the French went well beyond that. And that has allowed the Russians, for their own complicated reasons, to say, we're not going to allow this to happen in Syria. I'm now getting away from the minorities problem into the practical realpolitik of the thing, and I have no idea. I'm sure the administration is trying to talk to the Russians. The Russians are a kind of key. I mean, I do not for a second believe that it's just because of Soviet naval base at Tartus that the Russians are taking the attitude they're taking towards Syria. In many ways, on the face of it, it makes very little sense. They've got many more interests in Turkey, economic and geopolitical, than they have in Syria, and yet the Syrians are on one side of this argument and they on the other. So I don't know the answer. I'm a retired hack. I'm not a diplomat. I never was one, as you perhaps have gathered by my remarks. So I don't know what, but I do hope, I wish I were a believer. I'm not. I've been in the Middle East too long. But I mean, you people do believe, and you do move mountains. I don't know what. It seems to me there is a way to beat a drum and get some of the, and to concentrate the minds of the people who pretend to rule our fate. I mean, it makes no. I mean, these business of humanitarian corridors and flights. I mean, these are acts of regression. I mean, I say this, and I'm a Kurdophile, and I was very happy when the Kurds in northern Iraq were protected. But we've got to look in the face of what happened and not hide our heads in the sand. I don't know how you guys and the other groups that you're in touch with act. I'm a reporter by trade, not an activist. But I wish you would do something, and I'm very thankful that you've asked me today.
Ready for the next question? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. My name is Sylviane Zahid from Lorient Le Jour. French, you know me. I very much appreciate her question, but I don't think I agree with you.
I hope not.
And I feel that you are very pessimistic.
Yes, I'm
And another thing, I feel that you are unfair regarding Christians of Lebanon. The way you spoke in the beginning.
Excuse me.
Regarding the Christians.
I hope. You're correct to correct me. I should have said all along, radical Maronites, yes. Who were. I think I did say the Maronites are not all the Christians.
Yes, you did.
All right. So I mean, excuse me. I've been taken attacks many times by Lorient Le Jour and other Christian friends.
On another hand, also, do you believe that the Arab Spring is not spontaneous? Do you believe that it has been planned ahead under under the name democracy in the Middle East?
Well, that's an interesting question. You remember W, our dear friend W. He and Mrs. Rice thought capitalism and free elections were just going to solve all the problems. Mrs. Rice, I hope, when she goes to heaven or elsewhere, will have on her tomb the famous phrase that she mouthed in 2006 when the Israelis rather stupidly invaded South Lebanon, the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Well, I think W and Mrs. Rice were, they were drinking their own what was it? Kool-Aid. And I do think it was rather. I mean, why did this happen in Tunisia? I mean, I love Tunisia. It's one of my favorite places in the world. But it's a sideshow. It always has been. It always will be. Why did it start in Tunisia? Think about it. Didn't happen in Morocco. You know the old saying, North Africa, the Moroccans are the lions of North Africa, the Algerians are the men, and the Tunisians are the women. Why are the women? I mean, you know, this is. I admit I'm kind of inoculated against conspiracy theories. I've been around too long. I'm not saying there haven't been conspiracies, but I think to have conceived the Arab Spring to embarrass, my goodness, I mean, one of the big losers in the Arab Spring has been the West so far. If we look at American interests as they've been defined over the last 40 years, what's happening in Egypt is not what the Americans wanted. You could buy some things with American aid, but not others. So I don't know. I think the jury's out. But I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm sorry. I wish I were. I have a very good friend whose name who will go nameless, but he was a terrific reporter, and he read every newspaper. He got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, he read all the newspapers. He was so confused by the time he had to write in the evening that he became a right-winger, because it was easy, you know. He passed everything through the right-wing prism. Copy was beautiful. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Doug Costetter with the Mennonite Center Committee. Would you talk a little bit more about U.S. and French interests, diplomacy, and maybe intelligence involvement in the Lebanese, both originally and maybe currently?
Going back to
well, to your book era, and then.
Well, look, that's very simple. Lebanon was a sideshow. Lebanon was a place you could find anything out. As one regime after another became more totalitarian, a lot of smart people left. So if you worked a little bit and went out and met people, you met people from all over the Middle East who knew a lot about what was going on in the countries from which they came. So that was the usefulness of Lebanon to me as a reporter, and I'm sure to spooks of many nations, including our own. French is more complicated. You know, it's a long history. There's a wonderful book by an Englishman named Philip Mansell called Levant, and it's a wonderful book. And it's a history of Smyrna, Alexandria, and Beirut, which were basically all French-speaking cities. The French, you know, you go back to François Ier, you go back to it's a long period. Les échelles du Levant, what is that in English? Anyhow, what the French called that part of the Levant, they've been very active in it for a very long time. The capitulations protecting the Christians, who in many cases were Christian protected, French protected. And the French were forced out by the British at the end of World War II. De Gaulle never forgave the British. It's one of the many reasons the British had a rough time under de Gaulle. He felt humiliated. The Suez, 1956, French disaster, Franco-British disaster. The Algerian War, ending in 1962. By 1982, which is the moment of the Israeli war invasion, it's been 25 years since Suez, it's been 20 years since Algerian independence. The French wanted to get back in. When you look at how this was done, the multinational force that went in and protected the departure, the evacuation of the PLO, we didn't want to do it. It was 7 years after the end of the Vietnam War. Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense, didn't see any strategic interest in Israel, and actively disliked Sharon. Was at loggerheads with the State Department. The result was the French went in and started the evacuation. It tends to be forgotten because the French wanted to get they never said no. They were willing to lose men. They wanted to reassert themselves. So let's go back let's go forward a while. The French and the Americans were at loggerheads again over Iraq, W's war. The French refused to back it. Villepin, drinking the Kool-Aid, made a very moving but provocative speech. He'd called Powell up that day. Powell had come up to see him at his request, and Powell left, and after he left, Villepin made this speech. I mean, Powell felt betrayed, good reason. Next year, I mean, you may remember the Germans, the French, and the Russians all voted against the UN against the war. And what was the phrase? You forgive the Russians. You know, you punish the French. Something. I can't remember. You forget about the Russians and you forgive the Germans. I mean, so the next year, there's a real effort between Chirac and Bush to do something, to get over this unfortunate episode of, you know, this is when pouring French wine down the sewer and
freedom fries.
Freedom fries and cheese-eating surrender monkeys. There's a real effort the next year to get together. One of the things they did was a joint UN resolution about Lebanon, which I never understood why the Lebanese bought it. I mean, God, they've been betrayed backwards and forwards from the French, especially by ourselves over the years, but they jumped on it, they believed it, and that led to many things, and eventually the departure of the Syrian army. Let's not get into the messy history and the bloody history of what ensued, but I may have answered some of your question. Did I?
Yes.
Thank you. Sir.
Elias Mellon, Catholic Near East Welfare. The fairly recent Maronite Patriarch has spoken fairly favorably about Hezbollah. Do you think that's significant, especially because of what you have that they're calling the Shiite Crescent, Hezbollah's relationship with Iran and Iran's relationship with Syria?
Yeah, sure I do. But you know, we're getting into the mire of Lebanese politics. The Maronites is the only community which is split. It's interesting. You know, they used to dominate the institutions left behind by the French of the Lebanese Republic. Now they're a minority, and they're split. So half of them are still sort of the spiritual children of the Phalange, and the other half, who had been militantly anti-Syrian and anti-Muslim in general, are now in bed with Nasrallah. The Patriarch reflects this, I think, and he's been pro-Syrian. I think that is simply he's worried about Syrian Maronites. There are a lot of them. Nothing is simple in Lebanon. If you wish to know more about Lebanon, may I make an impassioned plea for you to go out and buy a book called Beware of Small States by my esteemed friend and brilliant colleague, David Hurst, published by Nation Books. Buy it, read it. All these things that we thought were nutty, making no sense, David explains. It's a brilliant book.
I'm Sally Cater with the U.S. Federation for Mid-East Peace. Thank you so much. You have enlightened all of us.
And depressed you.
Well, we were hoping for a better outcome, nothing that we didn't know.
She's sweetness on darkness.
So the situation in Lebanon, after what they have been through over the years, and it's back to the same positions, meaning the president of the sect and the whole system is still the same, and it's been so since the French. How do you see it with Nasrallah in the picture, and Syria is going on, and Iran? And how do you see it now? I know
it'll make you more depressed. You know what people were saying in Lebanon last year? Why is it calm, relatively calm, in Lebanon is because Lebanon is seeded for the finals. You know, once Syria's hash is settled, trouble will start in Lebanon again. I hope it's wrong. It has been relatively calm. Hezbollah is an very interesting case because, like many groups have been in power for a while now, they're beginning to show the usual Middle Eastern signs, human signs of corruption. You know, there was I hate to say this, I hope I won't go to have a fatwa aimed at me, but there was a kind of Lebanese Shia Madoff, the Ponzi scheme, who was ripping off people. So Nasrallah's had problems. Why shouldn't he? Everybody else has. But he, you know, remember in 2006 he was in an extraordinary situation. He, a militant Shia Muslim, was the hero of the Muslim world, which is predominantly Sunni. That stopped, partly because of Syria, but partly simply because of the internal contradictions of dominating. Nobody stays in power very long without having contradictions. I'm being very polite in this case. I could say corruption.
So you see it now, it's kind of calm before.
This one. I fear. But I'm wrong. I'm very bad when it comes to the crystal ball.
Would you have a final word? I mean,
I want you guys, you're believers, I want you out and pray.
All right. Well, thank you.
Facetious.
That's all right. It's never facetious about prayer. Thank you for your time with us, Jonathan. Doug, do you want to do a 30-second commercial about Doug is the other co-chair of the Israel-Palestine Working Group. Do you want to do a 30-second commercial about our next event?
Okay, next Thursday, actually in this room at 10:30
right about now again.
noon, will be a journalist from Gaza, a photojournalist from Gaza, who will be here showing his pictures, talking about the impact of the war and the Arab Spring, or the current situation in Gaza today. So here, 11th floor, next Thursday, 10:30.
Jonathan will be available to sign his book. I've been told that, not necessarily by him, but I was told that.
You understand the power of it.
And Helena asked me to remind you that we do have other books. We have Jonathan's books and other books from Just World Press back at the back. Ralph.
I'd like to recognize we have the Lebanese ambassador and his wife with us here.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. Would you like to have the final word?
I mean, thank you very much. I mean, but just to say that John, I mean, is a how many years old friend now? I mean, at least since 1982, and you need. I don't know why he recommended the Beware of Small Nations. I would rather recommend The Tragedy of Lebanon.
Very good. Very good. Thank you.
Set off the top, but really, I mean it. Especially for informed, intelligent, concerned groups, I really recommend David's book. It's an extreme. It is the only book that I know of that has gone back. It has to do with the Israeli, the Lebanon's relationship, not just with the state of Israel, but before. As I say, all these things that seem absolutely mad and incomprehensible, David explains without being didactic about it. It's terribly important. It's the most important book on Lebanon by a journalist that I've ever read.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, SCP.